Long-range drone attacks are a common enough feature of the war in Ukraine at this point that they usually wouldn't merit separate discussion. But I think there's a compelling argument for an exception when the explosions involved are large enough to generate mushroom clouds and register on seismic sensors. And such was the case recently when Ukraine struck 3 Russian storage bases in rapid succession, beginning with the 107th Arsenal of the Main Artillery and Rocket Directorate on the 18th of September. Today, we'll be touching on some significant issues, including how much damage may have been done and what the implications might be for Russian logistics going forward. But I'd also suggest that the sheer amount of Russian munitions prematurely converted into a localised pyrotechnic show are certainly significant, but not the main reason I think these strikes are important to talk about. Instead, I'd argue it's remarkable because, at least on paper, it arguably shouldn't have happened. Drones arguably shouldn't have been able to hit these sites. When they did, they probably shouldn't have done any damage. When they did damage, it probably shouldn't have been enough to cause catastrophic explosions. And when they did cause catastrophic explosions, the Ukrainians probably shouldn't have been able to repeat the exercise twice more in the following days. Hardened strategic ammunition storage facilities deep in the opposing rear, prepared for the worst World War III style contingencies, are not meant to be the kind of thing that you can destroy with the sorts of drones Ukraine is believed to have at their disposal. And so today I want to explore some early theories around why something that shouldn't have happened very much did. Ask what kind of assistance a very well-planned and executed Ukrainian operation may have received from familiar allies, Russian corruption and incompetence, explore some of their potential results, and the way they potentially reflect on the strategy and policy of Ukraine's various allies to date, and potential trajectories for the war to come. To do that, I want to start by going over some background, Ammo Logistics 101, and how these arsenals and bases fit into the overall Russian storage and logistics scheme. Then I want to look specifically at some arsenals and depots of interest, including the ones that were attacked, go over the attacks themselves, and ask a couple of important questions in sequence. How did this happen? Why did these things explode the way they did? How much damage was likely done? And what might the implications of these attacks be going forward? Okay, so to quickly set some context here, let's talk Ammunition Logistics 101 and how these sites fit into the Russian picture. In many ways, supplying ammunition to a battlefront isn't that much different to supplying just about any other good to a final consumer, although there are absolutely a few nuances. You generally want to get it from the factories where it's produced to the penultimate consumer, your troops and units at the battlefront, who will then generally organise a final high-velocity delivery in the direction of the enemy. Attractive potential targets as they often are, ammunition factories don't tend to get built up close to potential or actual front lines. So especially in the cases of countries like Russia that have a little bit of geographic heft to them, you're usually not talking about the shortest of delivery distances. There are a couple of characteristics of ammunition that also, especially during an active war, make it a tad more complicated to deal with in a logistics sense. It's often a high-mass, high-demand good. Historically, combat units fighting a conventional offensive or defensive campaign during the 20th century would consume more tonnage of ammunition than any other category. So you're often going to have to move a lot of it a fair distance, which limits the modes of transportation it's often practical to use. It also tends to have specialised handling and storage requirements, as you might expect, for things that are often explicitly designed to explode, but annoyingly, often also somewhat variable demand. All else being equal, you'd expect ammunition consumption to wax and wane given the level of intensity of fighting at the front. Yes, troops with access to a surplus of ammunition might sometimes find creative ways to justify using it, but we've often seen in Ukraine how consumption of artillery ammunition, for example, spikes in areas of elevated offensive activity. You start putting these factors together and you can probably understand just how important depots and arsenals can be. You can't just have your factories start producing ammunition when it's needed unless you expect your opponent to kindly give you a year or two to get your capacity spun up, so you have to produce and store it in advance to account for any potential surge in demand. You don't want to store it all at your factories because then the system's unlikely to be very responsive. If you do need ammunition at the front, it has the maximum possible distance to travel. But at the same time, you probably don't want to presumptively push it all down to units at the front line, because then you run into problems including those forward depots being considerably more vulnerable to things like HIMARS strikes like we saw back in 2022, given that A, they tend to be closer to the enemy, and B, lack a lot of the hardened facilities you might see at a specialised explosives handling facility, and C, because if you incorrectly project which parts of the fronts may be the busiest and have the highest demand for munitions, you may find yourself less well placed to respond or having to shuffle supplies laterally, as opposed to pushing large, efficient shipments through established logistics chains. So the solution almost every military has come up with is secure storage facilities and installations that function as a midpoint between the producer and the consumer. Depending on the context and the force in question, these magazines and storages could be in dedicated facilities or attached to other military bases and airstrips, with a general emphasis on safety when you're talking about storing ammunition and explosives. There are a couple of different approaches out there to building magazines to store ammunition and explosives. One of the most common configurations is called an earth-covered magazine, or ECM, and you can see a diagram from a US document showing some of the key features of those on the right there. You have the actual storage building itself, built in an arch or a flat top shape normally, with a layer of soil cover on top, and then a variety of engineering features intended to reduce the odds of a localised second sunrise. Another option, potentially for lower risk storage scenarios, might be an above ground magazine which lacks that soil covering and sometimes some of the other features as well. Or, you could just pile all your munitions up in a gigantic high explosive mound out there in the open for all to see. But we'll get back to that semi-patented Russian approach a little bit later on. The point is, for a lot of militaries where you find a lot of munitions, you'll often find ECMs. The US DoD alone is believed to possess tens of thousands of the things. And I have an image of a relatively standard one on the right there with some of those key engineering features marked. An actual blast door, for example, plus wing walls and a covering on top. In Russia, some of the largest and most important munition storage sites are the arsenals controlled by the Main Missile and Artillery Directorate, GRAU. This is an organisation that can actually claim a lineage back to 1862, when it was created as the Main Artillery Directorate. The rockets came later. They're also the ones responsible for creating a lot of the designations you might see used when referencing Russian or Soviet military equipment. With the 2S7 Pion heavy self-propelled gun, for example, 2S is the GRAU designation for a self-propelled gun, and the number 7 is associated with the Pion specifically. Those pieces of historic trivia aside, I bring the Directorate up because they do control some very significant installations, two of which have recently been entered into the escalating competition for greatest pyrotechnic display of 2024. So let's have a quick look at some of the Directorate's major facilities, and here I want to focus on ones that are relatively proximate to Ukraine, noting that in late 2024, proximate doesn't quite mean what it used to in this world of long-range one-way attack drones. Here I'm pivoting off some of the work done at Defence Express to highlight sites within 750 kilometres of the internationally recognised border with Ukraine, and given that we can be fairly confident that that does fall within Ukrainian drone range, I think it's as good a definition as any. We'll start with the 107th Arsenal, which you can see on the bottom right there, positioned near the town of Toropets. The base went through significant modernisation in the late 2010s, and then extensive further remodelling earlier this month, meaning that the map you see on screen there is now rather updated, so I'll bring up a new one. And there you go, it's the one just underneath the giant mushroom cloud. We'll get some overhead satellite imagery again in a moment. Relatively close by, but a bit smaller than the 107th, is the 23rd Arsenal, covering an area of about 2.3 square kilometres. And while it didn't get anywhere near the same uplift in the 2010s as the 107th, as you can see, it too went through a major remodelling exercise earlier this week. Much further to the north, closer to St. Petersburg, you have the 13th Arsenal, covering about 3 square kilometres. Closer to Moscow, and thus probably a much harder drone target given its proximity to Moscow's air defence grid, you have the 51st Arsenal, covering about 3.5 square kilometres. And then further to the northeast again, you have the largest and perhaps hardest target on this list, the 73rd Arsenal, covering 7 square kilometres, although a lot of that is just forested. One much closer to Ukraine, and now probably a significantly less attractive Russian military posting than it was a week ago. You have the 67th Arsenal, covering about 3.5 square kilometres, much closer to that Ukrainian border, as I said. While the final one on our list is the comparatively smaller 68th Arsenal, at about 2.5 square kilometres, down there in the Caucasus. When you're talking about places Russia stores ammunition in rear areas, as well as those Directorate arsenals, you also have a wide variety of other depots and ammunition dumps. And make no mistake, some of these can be very large, even if they don't always have the same sort of investments made into them. Earlier this month, for example, there was a reported drone strike on a Russian ammunition depot in the Voronezh region. Not one of those Directorate arsenals we just talked about, but still a pretty significant bang regardless. And one of the 3 locations we're going to talk about today is an ammo depot in Tykross, specifically the Russian 719th Artillery Ammunition Base. Based on open-source satellite reconnaissance work by teams like Front Intelligence Insight, it appears that this location was more of a transit location than a full arsenal. You can get a characteristic feeling of the base from the image on screen there. Basically a location where a rail line can bring in ammunition supplies, and then they can be stored, at least for a while, in what were basically open pits surrounded by earth revetments. Given the location, the ammunition could then be picked up by truck for transit to the front. compared to the other two locations, Twycross is an interesting one. Closer to the front, less well protected, but still significant in that transit and temporary storage role because it undergone a significant expansion in 2023, it appears, to store North Korean munitions. Essentially, it's assessed that this was one of the stopping off points for munitions coming from North Korea before they eventually made it to the front in Ukraine. So those are the kinds of locations we're talking about and why they matter. So now let's talk about what hit them, how it hit them, and what sort of damage we can see done. The chosen weapon system for these attacks appears to have been Ukrainian long-range one-way attack drones. I'm basing that assessment on a couple of factors. Firstly, those are the systems that Ukraine and Russia both said were involved in the attack, and you would expect the Russian government would probably have made a big deal of it if a long-range Western precision-guided munition, for example, had been employed. If this attack had involved Storm Shadow or Scalp cruise missiles, for example, the Russians would have had every incentive to reveal that fact in order to cause a diplomatic rift between Ukraine and its allies, considering the Ukrainians do not have permission to fire those missiles into Russian territory. There's also the sheer scale of the attacks to consider. Multiple sites across multiple attacks in what Ukraine claims was a saturation strike. Finally, when we get to some imagery of the sites a little bit later on, you'll see some clues in the imagery that I think suggest multiple impact points. Given how extremely limited Ukraine's supply of long-range missiles is, anything that points to lots of systems being used at a particular strike, to me, suggests drones. And while we can never rule out the possibility of drones and missiles being used together in any given attack, as we go through these strikes, I suggest just reflecting for a moment on just how far Ukraine's long-range attack drone capabilities must have come to get to this point from where they were as recently as early 2023. So that's the what. Let's talk where and when. The first target that appears to have been hit is the 107th Arsenal near Twycross on the 18th of September. Although initially, while Russian government sources did indicate that yes, there had been a Ukrainian drone strike, the first claims were that the attack had been broadly unsuccessful, like some Ukrainian attempts against these sort of sites in the past. Following a number of statements by the governor of the region suggesting that all drones had been shot down, but some debris had caused fires on the ground, Russian state media carried this headline article, which somehow has not been taken down at time of recording, which included the following claim, quote, "No one has been severely injured in this morning's drone attack on Twycross in Russia's Tver region." The regional government quoted Governor Igor Rodenya as saying, "Most importantly, our citizens did not sustain serious injuries and no one was killed," Rodenya said. Earlier reports said a fire occurred at the scene where drone fragments fell in Twycross. A partial evacuation was ordered soon after the scope of the emergency had been evaluated, end quote. One of the problems from an information warfare perspective, though, was that by the time articles like this were being run, lecturing about the danger of falling drone debris and the fact that a small fire might have been caused by them, images and video of the fire in question were already starting to circulate on the internet. This, for example, is one still image of the fires in question, and they were significant enough to be spotted by some eyes in the sky. The returns on NASA's satellite-based fire detection system FIRMS were not exactly subtle, leaving us with every indication that the fires had spread across multiple square kilometres of territory, suggesting either that the Ukrainians had found a way to impart falling drone debris with enough destructive potential to rival carpet bombing or a very, very small nuclear weapon, or alternatively, the Russians leaving out in their reporting the small complication of hundreds or thousands of tons of munitions on the base cooking off in spectacular fashion. To add a little bit more evidence that the 107th wasn't having a great time on the 18th of September, we can also have a look at some of the seismic readings recorded on earthquake tracking sites. Twycross is not a seismically active region. Of the many years of data tracked by these sites, there were exactly 0 local earthquakes recorded. And then on the 18th of September, according to this dataset, there were about 21. The first and last events were also spaced many hours apart, implying that this was almost certainly more than one major explosion. Ukraine may or may not have had rapid access to follow-up satellite imagery to help them assess the scale of the damage at the site. But even just what was available to the public relatively quickly was arguably enough to indicate that the site had been hurt and hurt badly. And so following on from the 18th, it appears that Ukraine decided to do one of the most logical things you can do when you attempt something pretty grandiose and it works when it perhaps shouldn't. They tried again. The smaller 23rd Arsenal will be struck about 3 days later, on the 21st of September. Here we don't have quite as many public claims on how many systems were used in the attack, but otherwise, most of the indications of the results appear to have been pretty similar. Large images of fire, massive returns on NASA's FIRM system, and another massive apparent win for drone debris against what was meant to be a hardened storage site. Plus, presumably in part because things are always funnier when they happen a third time, we also received news around this same time that the 719th had been hit as well. Remember, this wasn't a directorate arsenal, but rather a significant depot that played an important role in getting North Korean munitions to the Russian frontline. Lacking many of the same protected magazines that you might see at the other two arsenals, the result at Twycross was probably more predictable. Some drones presumably found their targets, and despite all the complaints we've seen from some Russian sources about the average quality of some of the munitions supplied by North Korea, this impromptu Ukrainian quality assurance inspection does appear to have proved that at least some of the North Korean munitions do explode. As a bonus for the Ukrainians, this ammunition depot was also very close to a nearby Russian airbase. And before long, firms were showing fires there as well, although we don't have any indication that any airframes were damaged or destroyed. We'll go through a more detailed attempt to assess how much ammunition may have been destroyed and how much damage was done to these sites a little bit later on. But we already have enough information in hand at this point to be relatively sure about at least a few things. We can be fairly confident about what sites were hit, what they were hit with, Ukrainian long-range attack drones, although we can't be sure yet what sort of drones were used in the strikes. And given the scale of the devastation, the images and video we got, the fact that secondary explosions continued for some time and the firm's returns were what they were, we can be fairly sure that a lot of very explosive things were being stored at these sites, and that those munitions were affected by a pretty serious premature detonation problem as a result of the Ukrainian attack. But none of that so far answers the core question I asked earlier. How do you take relatively small drone-carried warheads and convert them into mushroom clouds? I think the most reasonable top-level theory is that it takes a lot of effort to turn a relatively small warhead into a seismic event, and so what we might be looking at here is one heck of a team effort, with the Russian team making a significant contribution to the Ukrainian effort at multiple levels. From the construction and the design of these sites, down to their administration, the operation of rank-and-file personnel working at them, and then a Ukrainian plan and execution that could effectively capitalise on the compounding effects of corruption and incompetence at multiple levels of the Russian system. And to get a better idea of what I'm trying to talk about here, let's have a look at some of the jigsaw puzzles at the various levels and how the overall picture fits together. And here I want to start at the top level: requirement setting, design and construction. Did Russia have the kind of storage facilities and infrastructure it needed? And if not, why not? For this segment, we'll come back to the two smaller sites in a moment, but I really want to start by looking at Twycross, the big one, and also the first one to be hit. Because out of all three, while the Twycross site was obviously the biggest prize, on paper it should have been the best protected and least likely to explode. And arguably its mere existence revealed the fact that some in the higher echelons of the Russian leadership recognised a need to invest in ammunition storage facilities, their modernisation, and also their survivability. The Twycross storage site itself is an old Soviet one, but the facilities had been significantly expanded and modernised in the 2010s, and when those modernisations were announced as complete in 2018, the Russians had some pretty boastful things to say about the resilience of the site. Then Deputy Defence Minister Dmitry Bulgakov reportedly said the following: "The arsenal ensures safe and secure storage, protects weapons from aerial and missile strikes, and even from the damage of a nuclear explosion." He also reportedly said that if you compare present arsenals with what they used to be, storage in open areas and wooden storage facilities, and what they are today in concrete storage facilities, the difference is roughly the same as walking around in body armour that protects you from being hit by bullets or shrapnel, or walking around without it. Now, I'd like you to just mentally file away that comment he made about moving from storage in open areas and wooden storage facilities towards concrete instead, because we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. But first, let's talk about these concrete storage facilities that are meant to protect weapons from aerial and missile strikes and even nuclear explosions. Because while our level of confidence is very low at this point, and I owe a lot to the work of some online analysts, which I'll link at the top of the description, there's a few clues out there that Russia may have skipped a few steps in hardening their hardened storage facilities. For example, as a general rule, if you want to harden a particular target, one way to do so might be to dig it into the ground. That wasn't the Russian approach. Some of the imagery we have appears to show the Twycross facilities basically being built at surface level. Our commentator notes that the ground appears to have been cleared, but not excavated, with the ECM just being built at surface level. Note, you can absolutely build surface-level magazines. Various Western militaries use them for all sorts of purposes, but if you don't have that added protection which comes from digging it in and covering it with a layer of material, you better make sure that all the other features of the magazine are up to scratch. On the left of the diagram on screen, you can see some of the features that you would expect to see on a magazine in a NATO country, including appropriate blast doors and, if it is an ECM, a thick layer of soil cover on top. The image on the right then supposedly shows what some of the Twycross magazines looked like during the construction phase. Unless there was serious amounts of adamantium and stellinium involved in the construction process, I'm not sure how much blast I'd expect those doors to take. There's more we could dwell on, including the roof design and lack of covering, but by this point you probably get the picture. There are a lot of things you can do to make a magazine as likely as possible to keep enemy explosives out and friendly explosives in. And it may be that the state-of-the-art facility at Toropets was missing several of them. But at least at Toropets, they actually bothered to construct actual magazines. Some of the storage facilities at Twycross, for example, appear to have just been basically covered pits in some cases surrounded by revetments, which is arguably the kind of phoning it in that might not be a great idea more than 2.5 years into a war like this one. In other words, across these facilities, sometimes the bunkers weren't all that they could be, and in other cases they were barely bunkers. And all of this is just the problems and shortcomings that we can visibly see. What we can't see for sure is the hundreds of other ways corners may potentially have been cut during the design and construction process. Maybe someone scored a few kickbacks using subpar materials, poor workmanship, the omission of optional features. I mean, if you're going to skip the blast doors on a magazine, what won't you skip? And many more potential vectors for corruption aside, we can't be sure. But given what else we've seen, I thought it was worth flagging the possibility, which leads us at this stage to the question of why. Why might a country which is so reliant on using and stockpiling vast amounts of munitions, preparing for potential conflicts against opponents known to have long-range precision munitions, design and construct munition storage facilities like this? And while there's a lot that potentially goes into that decision, and I'm going to resist the urge to break out the relevant Chernobyl clip here, some of the potential motivations might be familiar to anyone who's ever worked on any project ever. Cutting corners can be cheaper, easier, faster, and also potentially provide more opportunities for entrepreneuring individuals involved in the process to, shall we say, augment their financial position a little. If you're an enterprising high-level official and government approves you enough funds to build a top-tier storage facility, and then you stupidly go about actually building a top-tier storage facility, all those funds are probably going to be expended. Indeed, you may even go over budget. But if instead you take your 10 out of 10 budget and build a 5 out of 10 facility, you can almost certainly deliver a product to government within the allowed budget and deliver a lot of what's left over into the pockets of you or your mates. On a completely unrelated note to this purely theoretical possibility, let me again introduce you to Deputy Defense Minister Dmitry Bulgakov. Bulgakov essentially dominated the logistics function for the Russian Defense Ministry for the better part of 15 years. He's also the one I quoted earlier, implying that some of these magazines might be able to handle kilotons of munitions, not kilos. He was reportedly quite close to former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, but that didn't stop him being dismissed from his position back in September 2022 due to the phenomenal performance of Russian logistics in the opening stages of the full-scale invasion, and then finally was arrested for, you will never believe this, corruption in 2024. Now, I'm not saying we have any concrete evidence implying that Bulgakov engaged in any sort of corrupt activity in relation to the modernisation of these various arsenals, but I can imagine a universe in which someone drawing up a hypothetical list of individuals who had won the title, Hero of the Russian Federation, who might be a bit of a look-in for the equivalent title, Hero of Ukraine, they might consider slipping Bulgakov onto that list. However, as tempting as it might be to just sit and hypothesise about the potential role played by individuals at the top, I think it's important to stress that we have every indication here that the issues may have gone far, far deeper than just top-level decision-making. Let's say, hypothetically, the ECMs were kind of shit and had a build quality reminiscent of that local tradie who thinks that plasterboard and double brick are basically the same thing. We can't walk past the role the way these sites were being administered and run in the explosions we eventually witnessed. Because even the best, most reinforced magazine in the world will only protect munitions if they are inside the magazine. Problem, that requires carrying munitions inside the magazines and also departing from a long-established Russian tradition of long-term ammunition storage, piling up massive amounts of explodium in the bloody open. Images like the ones we have on the right there from Toropets, taken 9 May 2024, indicate that while yes, there might have been protective structures and magazines on site, it seems like a lot of munitions may just have been dumped in basically open-air storage sites with maybe some earth revetments around them. The obvious problem with doing this should be obvious. Even if your magazines can fend off a lot of opposing munitions, they're probably not going to be able to stop just about anything your opponent can throw your way, setting off these stockpiles. You're probably going to get fire, you're probably going to get explosions, and the danger that those fires and explosions cause more fires and explosions. So why on earth would you ever do it this way? There's a couple of potential reasons. Maybe the magazines were already full to capacity and this was overflow storage. Or maybe it's that Russian ammunition logistics tends to be a very manual process. You're not going to see a huge amount of palletization and forklifts, for example. And so in some cases, leaving shit out in the open might just have been easier. And hey, if Private Conscriptovich and his mates suspect that someone at the top scored a couple of rubles on the side by building shitty bunkers in the first place, what incentive does he or anyone else involved have to put in the extra sweat in order to make sure that everything is stored properly? I need to stress that while you will find Russian voices making these sort of accusations and claims, it's very hard for us on the outside looking in to be entirely sure. We're mostly in the domain of speculation here. It certainly seems from some of this satellite imagery like the approach to ammunition storage on some of these bases was such that if senior NCOs from some NATO militaries ever got onto these bases and saw conditions firsthand, they'd probably be significantly torn between what to do first, go apoplectic with rage or collapse with a brain aneurysm. But we need to understand that by peacetime Russian standards, this might have been considered entirely acceptable. And at Twycross, where open storage with some revetments was the norm, not the exception, because the base didn't have the kind of ECMs you might have seen at the 107th, we can probably veer a little bit closer towards concluding that open storage like this was probably a feature, not a bug, of that particular installation. But even if that was the case at Twycross or with the open storage at Toropets, and what we saw wasn't corruption and incompetence, but the intended product through and through, I think there's an argument to suggest that even if corruption and incompetence were absent, their good friends complacency and inertia absolutely were. Put them together and you get CC, and CC loves to ruin everything. Essentially, the argument here is that corruption and incompetence can put you in a bad situation, but complacency and inertia can prevent you getting out of it before it's too late. Let's just say, for example, that back in 2018, everything about these sites was considered perfectly acceptable. These unexcavated, uncovered ECMs with the questionable blast doors were perfectly adequate for the task intended because they were capable of fending off the kinds of threats the Russians wanted them to fend off. They could stop cluster munitions, for example, or, while they couldn't handle a direct nuclear blast, that'd be a lot to ask of any magazine structure, they could probably handle, hypothetically, a pressure wave from a detonation some way in the distance. What they probably couldn't stop might have been something like a penetrating warhead on a cruise missile, but that may never have been the intention. Maybe the Russians concluded that the level of protection necessary to stop a cruise missile was a step too far for bases this far in the Russian rear, and so it was enough just to have a bare minimum level of protection against the kind of likely threats the base could potentially face. Whether that represents incompetence or complacency or not, I'll leave to the audience. The bit where the second C comes in, though, is that we're not in 2018. We're in September 2024. This war has been going on for some time now, and so we, the general public, understand, and so hopefully the Russian military does as well, that A, Ukrainian long-range drones exist, B, they have the range to reach these sites, C, they've been capable of hitting sensitive locations as far afield as Moscow, and that D, while they may not have the penetrating power of something like the Broach warhead on the Storm Shadow, their payloads have been increasing into the double-digit kilo range and are probably likely to continue doing so. And yet no one at these sites appears to have thought that in the light of the evolving drone threat, maybe these ECMs needed reinforcement with additional covering, a drone cage, anything. Or, here's a wild idea, maybe less ammunition should be stacked out in the open where a bird with a magnifying glass could feasibly take out half the bloody base. That would fall into the category of complacency and inertia, an organisation or individuals within it refusing to recognise when circumstances have changed, and sticking with the established way of doing things until it's all far too late. The reality is we don't know the dynamics of what was happening on these Russian bases, how they did their risk evaluation, what they expected to happen in the event of a long-range Ukrainian drone attack, nor why they may have adopted the storage practices they appear to have adopted. What is clear is that when small amounts of Ukrainian explosives started to arrive on these sites, there was a lot of Russian explosive positioned and ready to assist in their mission. And as we'll see in just a minute, those world-standard protected magazines definitely now appear in a lot of cases to have seen much better days. Now, I think it's also important to highlight the other side of this equation, which is the Ukrainian effort and the extent to which their long-range strike capabilities have expanded and matured as the war has gone on. After all, it is absolutely possible to imagine a world in which Russia's ammunition storage logistics were weakened by corruption or incompetence, much as other parts of the Russian military and defence industrial complex appear to have been in previous years. But often the only way for that sort of corrosion in a system to have very real, obvious impacts that are visible even to the general public is for some major internal or external pressure to come along and reveal how brittle the entire system actually is. If you build bomb-proof bunkers that aren't actually bomb-proof because everyone wants to pocket a little bit on the side, there's decent odds that no one in power is going to notice or care particularly until a bomb is applied to that bunker, causing results that are very different to what was promised. And in this case, it's arguably pretty impressive that the Ukrainians were able to take a flame to this particular tinderbox in the way they were. So firstly, we probably need to comment on the scale and implied long-term planning that probably went into these attacks. In some of the reporting around the attack on Twycross, for example, two features stand out. Firstly, the allegation that this was a kind of saturation attack that may have involved roughly 100 drones. And secondly, attestations from some Russians nearby that they believe they heard jet propulsion systems before the drones hit. That implies Ukraine may have had to go through the process of developing a long-range, high-speed, jet-powered one-way attack drone, which is not a system they started with in service in 2022, and in a little over 2.5 years, go from a point where Ukraine's long-range attack drone capability was basically repurposed Alibaba models being launched in ones and twos, to the point where we can hear reports of the Ukrainians launching saturation attacks with long-range drones and deploying jet-powered systems, and not just immediately dismiss them out of hand as entirely non-credible. For many modern militaries, 2.5 years in a research and development sense is basically nothing. There are probably forces out there that would struggle to get a Mark II Dunny designed and fielded in 2.5 years, let alone entire new families of long-range munitions. But now in September 2024, here we are. And I think it remains an open question where Ukraine's long-range drone capabilities will be in 2025. But to get back to these strikes, the next observation, after the scale and the systems involved, is the timing. And I mean that really in two respects. Firstly, in the case of at least some of these attacks, Ukraine claims that the long-range strike took place after an operation to knock out a Russian Podlet K warning radar, degrading Russian air defences and increasing the odds that the attack made it through. If true, it would arguably be another example of Ukraine's we have CAD, DAD at home approach to dealing with Russian air defences. And then beyond just the question of finding the opening, across these cases, it appears that drones tended to hit the target at a point where ammunition trains were present on site and in the process of loading or unloading. And across the three sites, it seems there could be dozens of train cars that may have been full of ammunition, sitting somewhere on the spectrum from mildly damaged to Thanos snapped. Even if a train wasn't present at the time of the strike, some of these locations are believed to have had recent, potentially quite valuable deliveries. There are some claims, for example, although they are only claims at this point, that the 23rd Arsenal had received shipments of surface-to-air missiles from Belarus not that long before these attacks took place. Timing to hit these locations while a train was in the process of loading or unloading has a lot of potential value from a mission planning perspective, if you can get the timing right. The locomotive, rail cars, and ammunition itself is obviously valuable, but it also gives you a major potential source of yet another secondary explosion. Even if all of the Russian magazines were appropriately built, resistant to the Ukrainian drones and unlikely to set each other off, the ammunition on or around the train, and there might be a lot of it, isn't going to be protected by a magazine. Meaning that by getting their timing right, if this wasn't just a happy accident, the Ukrainians maximise the odds that even if the attack didn't achieve what it set out to do, it might have achieved something. As it is, the devastation in the main storage areas has often drawn away a lot of the attention, but I think it would be wrong to look past this quirk of the operation and the damage done. The other point is that Ukraine was able to significantly compound the amount of damage they did with the Twycross strike by rapidly following up. We obviously don't know if the strikes against the other two targets were always planned, regardless of the first results, or if they were planned as contingencies or just thrown together at the last moment. But what is clear is that Ukraine tried something relatively new, it very clearly and dramatically worked, and then they were able to repeat that approach at least twice more within the space of a couple of days before Russia would feasibly have much time to react or adapt. Ukraine may not have had the inventory or capacity to continue striking at that rate after the first three, but being able to capitalise on this apparent vulnerability once it was found is probably part of the reason Russia is down 3 significant ammunition storage bases, not one. And it's been a very long process in Ukraine in terms of design, construction, doctrine, training and execution to get from those individual ultralight care packages dispatched to Russian targets on individual commercial drones to bunker busting multiple Russian ammunition storages in the space of a week. And that, I think, brings us to the question of how much damage was actually done. And thankfully, since I'm making this video a number of days after the strikes occurred, we have some better imagery available, and we can base that assessment on a little bit more than just distant pictures of a massive fireball or two. The imagery used in this section is by Maxar, and I'll link the source in the description. So let's start with the first target to be hit, Twycross, and you can see an image of it prior to the strike on the right there, giving you a sense of scale and its relative position. This is then a slide showing before and after images of Twycross positioned side by side. Instantly, the scale of the devastation should become fairly obvious. If we think of this base as falling into three sections, that southern section, which is interspersed with tree cover, that northwest section, complete with the rectangular revetments, and the eastern component, where you can see all of those concrete magazines, none of those sections have escaped significant damage. In the southern section, we can see that a lot of the buildings have been almost entirely erased. One or two have been replaced with obvious craters, indicating that whatever explosion took place there was powerful enough not just to destroy the structure, but also to blast apart the revetment around it. And then if we zoom in closer on the northern section, things don't get much better. As far as I can tell, none of the buildings in that western segment are still standing, and several have been thoroughly craterized. If any non-negligible amount of useful munitions remain in that section, one, recovering them is going to be complicated by an insane degree of unexploded ordnance threat, and two, unless you really hated the artillery unit in question, I can't imagine anyone being particularly keen to issue those munitions as safe for active use. The most interesting segment, though, has to be the concrete magazines in that eastern section. After all, these were probably some of the most protected structures, at least on paper, that you would find in this arsenal. And based on this image, which I've rotated to better fit on the slide, I think it's fair to say that a lot of those magazines just don't exist anymore. And indeed, if you're looking to split this up into categories, I'd probably divide it into the fully craterized ones, like the one you can see in the dead center, the ones that have ceased to exist, which are mostly concentrated towards the right-hand side of the image, those that have been damaged but still appear to be somewhat intact, particularly interesting there being those that you can see in some cases that appear to have some sort of penetrating holes on the roof of the structure, but which haven't detonated. This is always difficult with satellite imagery because you just don't have the resolution to be sure, but it does certainly seem like in some cases something has been able to punch through into the magazine, but then for some reason the magazine hasn't detonated. One possibility is you might have had munitions penetrating without a catastrophic result. Say the warhead didn't detonate and the munition didn't do enough to cause the ammunition inside to detonate, or there may just not have been that many explosive things inside the magazine to begin with. We absolutely cannot be sure, for example, that all of these structures were actually full to capacity. There do appear to be a number of cases where the magazine structure is still standing. Those are concentrated towards the left-hand side of the image. That suggests to me that this part of the facility may not have been a total loss, although the Ukrainians would probably have reasons to feel very, very satisfied with this kind of performance by long-range drone systems. And I'd also suggest that even if some resources are recoverable from this base following some clean-up efforts, its utility as a storage facility, node in the Russian logistics system, as a directorate arsenal is probably significantly diminished. A lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed, and a lot of what's left is probably significantly contaminated. In terms of estimating the volume of Russian munitions involved in this attack, there have been a lot of numbers thrown around in the media by various sources. Just from first principles, there are a couple of things that we can say that we probably know for certain, and a lot of things we don't know. We know that we witnessed a mushroom cloud, we know there were multiple detonations, and we know that the burning at the site extended for multiple days. We know that there was a press conference that the Russians held where you can still hear the crackle of secondary detonations going off in the background, and we have that seismic data. That suggests there were at least some individual detonations strong enough to set off those seismic detectors, and if you want a very rough sense of historical scale here, the Beirut explosion back in 2020 registered a 3.3 on the Richter scale, higher than any of the results I've seen from this base, while being a roughly 1.1 kiloton equivalent explosion, so equivalent to 1.1 thousand tons of TNT going off at once. For additional context, that would be very roughly 1/15th, I think, from memory, the yield of the first atomic weapon used in anger during the Second World War. So if we're guesstimating here, that would seem to indicate that the largest explosions at Twycross were in the double to triple digit tonnage range. But even then, there's two asterisks to throw on even that rough guesstimate. Firstly, we don't know what was exploding here. It probably wasn't pure TNT, and it could be almost anything. There could be propellant charges, rocket fuel, high explosive and thermobaric warheads, the list goes on. And so translating a TNT equivalent yield into how many tons of actual munitions were destroyed is obviously difficult, especially when, with a lot of munitions out there, like artillery shells for example, most of the weight of the munition is not an explosive charge. The second caveat is this wasn't one single explosion, it was a series of explosions that carried on for some time. And it's very, very difficult to even guess what the total sum of all munitions detonated across all of those detonations and fires actually was. In terms of foreign estimates, one of the most frequently cited figures I've heard is an estimate of 30,000 tonnes of munitions destroyed by Estonian Defence Intelligence. That estimate then goes on to translate that tonnage of destroyed munitions into a number of artillery shells and implies that it roughly represents 2 to 3 months of Russian artillery fire. Personally, I'd be less certain about making those sort of calculations because it's likely that lots of different sorts of munitions were stored at the site, not just artillery shells. And I'm not sure if there's any way for us using open source information to confirm the site actually had anywhere close to 30,000 tonnes of munitions present. But to an extent, I'd almost suggest that trying to hone in on a particular figure almost misses the point. It's very hard to determine for sure, and unless the actual result is a significant outlier compared to a lot of the estimates, it probably doesn't move the needle that much either way on the implications. What we do know is the site was fairly thoroughly wrecked, recovering and repairing it will take a while, and a lot of munitions must have been destroyed given the scale of the explosions and damage to the site. You can probably apply similar logic to the second site that was hit in the area. Here, once again, you have a before image on the left, after image on the right, and once again, you might find it quicker to count structures that are still standing as opposed to those that are being destroyed. A majority of the structures at this facility and whatever they were protecting are probably write-offs. A significant amount of Russian explosive material was probably detonated in the attack because it's very difficult to imagine drones being able to do this much damage with their onboard warheads just by themselves. And cleaning up and reconstituting this base so it can again usefully and safely play a role in the Russian logistics system is probably not going to be any small exercise. Finally, if you look at Twycross, again before on the left, after on the right, we don't have as many destroyed buildings in this case, but primarily because there weren't as many buildings to destroy in the first place. Instead, you can see plenty of evidence where explosive materials may have either detonated or burned in the open, leaving everything from large craters, like you can see in the centre there, to large areas that show signs of burning, and now empty revetments, where once ammunition was presumably stored. The amount of lost infrastructure here doesn't appear to compare to the other two installations, but again it appears likely that a majority of the munitions that were present are no longer present, except in fine dust form, and that contamination of the site may be extensive. So clearly the largely open-air storage methods employed at the base weren't sufficient to prevent a number of things going horribly wrong. But for all it's interesting to talk about what went wrong and some of the reasons why it might have gone wrong, I think it's really incumbent on us to zoom out and have a look at the bigger picture here. In the context of a war that does consume millions of munitions, what impact can 3 drone strikes really have? And so let me start by stressing what this strike absolutely doesn't do. It doesn't mean the Russian military is out of ammunition. It doesn't mean it's going to be unable to carry on its offensive operations in the short, medium or long term. It doesn't overcome Russia's general advantage in munitions availability compared to the Ukrainians, and it doesn't mean the Russian ammunition supply chain more broadly won't be able to adapt in some way. At this sort of scale, what you're looking at is more of an incremental impact than a decisive one. The Soviet supply system of the Cold War era, to a significant extent, was built up on the understanding that if war ever went hot with NATO, you should expect to lose entire military units, pieces of critical infrastructure, storage bases, etc., potentially in a flurry of nuclear fireballs, but the system had to be capable of continuing to push munitions forward regardless. The war had to go on, even if mushroom clouds provided the backdrop. The Russian system now might be a pale shadow of the Soviet one in the 70s and 80s, but drone strikes aren't nuclear strikes, and the war in Ukraine isn't World War III. We may see temporary effects in some Russian sectors as the system recalibrates and some areas have to be temporarily deprioritised, but the fact Russia is going to have less ammo and fewer active facilities doesn't mean it's going to have no ammo and no active facilities. However, that also doesn't mean these strikes didn't hurt. They did. Nor that Russia can now just readily imitate this new Ukrainian tactic in order to return the favour and balance the scales again. Russia does routinely claim to hit ammunition and weapon storage depots in Ukraine, and in some cases we have visual confirmation of them doing so. There have been some cases where it appears likely Ukraine lost quite a significant amount of munitions as a result of a long-range Russian strike. But there's a cap on how effective and how sustained an impact these sort of Russian strikes can hypothetically have. In Ukraine, a significant amount of the largest relevant stockpiles are not kept in Ukraine. The first destination for munitions leaving the factory in the United States or Europe probably isn't a site in Ukraine, but rather a storage facility in a NATO country. And it's from there that they can continually be trickled across the border and into the Ukrainian supply system. For responsiveness reasons, there's still obviously a need to maintain some stockpiles in Ukraine itself, but Ukraine and its various allies have the option to keep munitions stored well out of Russian strike range until they choose to put it at risk and commit it to Ukrainian territory. For example, the US Army opened a new large-scale weapons depot in Poland back in April 2023, and you have to imagine there would probably be consequences if that kind of site ever made it onto a Russian targeting list. But that's probably enough about what these strikes don't mean. What about what they do mean? And how might they have actually changed the way we look at things going forward? Firstly, just how hardened these various Russian storage depots are considered is probably something that should be looked at. Let's just say that an assumption had been in place, and I'm not saying such an assumption was in place, that in order to effectively attack these sites, you'd need specialised penetrating munitions to get into the magazines, and that you would potentially need quite a lot of them because the Russians couldn't possibly have built their magazines in such a way that one detonating posed a significant risk of detonating others as well, then you might not have classified these sites as potentially at risk or as a potential Russian vulnerability. Ukraine isn't believed to have significant amounts of long-range bunker-busting munitions, and a lot of what it has received that could potentially do the job are not allowed to be used on recognised Russian territory. If drones and more conventional munitions are capable of achieving these sort of effects, however, that assumption probably drops away. All of these targets should be considered in play and under very real, practical threat. There's also, I think, implications for the Russian air defence system and what constitutes enough air defence when you're talking about the sites that make up Russia's logistics backbone when it comes to munitions. If it's true, for example, that Ukraine employed saturation tactics and came after these targets with flocks of drones, as opposed to the relatively small numbers we saw in early 2023, then it's probably not sufficient to just have one or two short-range systems, for example, like Pantsir present doing defence work. The Russians recently showed off a new version of the Pantsir, for example, that replaces the gun system with a large number of small anti-drone missiles to optimise it against UAS threats. But if more drones come at this system in rapid succession than it has tubes, it's probably getting a participation award, and whatever location it's guarding might be explosively remodelled. In other words, this might just be another pressure further stretching Russia's air defence resources, where there are now more sites that definitely need to be protected because they're proven to be on the Ukrainian potential target list, and they also need to be heavily protected enough to fend off this sort of large-scale attack. And adding more air defences to better protect these sites might be the initial Russian response, because adapting to this sort of threat is probably considerably harder than with HIMARS back in 2022. There, you'll remember, Russia lost a lot of ammunition in rapid succession to strikes using Gimler's missiles fired by the couple of HIMARS units that Ukraine had operational at the time, and Russia's two primary adaptations that significantly dampened that threat were, one, to push ammunition storage out of HIMARS range, and two, to disperse that storage into smaller concentrations. That was somewhat more inefficient, sure, than the way they were doing it before, but having a bunch of your munitions destroyed by opposing missile strikes also doesn't tend to do great things to your supply system. The problem with this threat, though, to these larger storage facilities is that the adaptations on the table aren't really as practical or attractive. These facilities were valuable in part because they were connected to Russian infrastructure. They had railway connections, for example, specialised handling facilities. And yes, while the magazines may not have been the greatest, they do appear to have had some protective value. So if you try and disperse munitions away from these locations, wherever you choose to disperse it to may not have that same infrastructure, meaning those sites might be more vulnerable, less valuable from a logistics perspective, or both. It's also not clear how much of a practical defence increasing the range here really would be. Ukrainian drones have continued to fly further and further, and the Russian military would probably run into some pretty significant limits pretty quickly if it could no longer use its rail infrastructure, for example, to support its efforts to supply the front line in the same way. That's not to say Russia can't make some adaptations, change how it stores its ammo, where it stores its ammo, how that's handled, how it's shipped, how these sites are defended, etc. It's just to say the answers may not be as simple or as cheap as those in 2022, and those weren't cost-free either. I also think it's just an open question as to just how effectively and how quickly the Russian military would be able to change practices across the organisation. How quickly could you realistically instill very strict standards of ammunition stowage and safety? Can you practically stop people doing it the easy way, or will the ammunition mountains continue, whatever the directive is from on high? But for me, one of the most interesting implications here is that it arguably highlights just how important the restriction on the supply of Western long-range weapons and their use against recognised Russian territory may have been. We know this war is about more than individual systems or individual platforms, and in the past, I've warned about the danger of overhyping potential game changers. Sinking too much energy into the pursuit of Wunderwaffe might distract attention from significant issues that require reform, problems that need addressing. But at the same time, this war has also proven, I'd argue, that capabilities absolutely matter. And here I'll raise the suggestion that if Ukrainian long-range drones in 2024 now have the capability to hit Russian arsenals, do it through the teeth of Russian air defences and inflict significant damage doing so, NATO VLO cruise missiles, for example, probably could have centre-punched every target of note within several hundred kilometres of the Ukrainian border. If different decisions were made, Ukraine could have had the capability to reach these targets, reach them sooner, and to sustain attacks after events like these recent successes. By having to try and fight the Russian army mostly at the front in Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainians have largely been forced to fight the Russian military very much on their terms. Tank for tank, shell for shell, while Russia has fully leveraged its advantage in standoff munitions and long-range fires. What Ukraine has not been able to do is go after a lot of the softer, potentially more vulnerable points of the Russian military system. And only now that they've developed at least a limited ability to reach out these distances and strike these sort of targets themselves, are we seeing hints as to what sort of effect those strikes might have had. Having two major arsenals and a significant depot hit probably isn't a catastrophe for the Russians. But if hypothetically every major arsenal within reasonable range of Ukraine had been hit, it probably would have been a different story. The risk now, of course, is that while Ukraine continues to beg for long-range systems and the permission to use them against Russian territory, the Russians presumably would have noticed the attacks of the last week and started to do what they could to prepare for what might come next. Adaptation to the threat may not be simple, but the remaining directorate arsenals anywhere near Ukraine are probably never going to be easier targets than they are right now. But by the time long-range systems arrive, if they arrive, who knows how much that may have changed. The broader observation here about Western Allied strategy in Ukraine so far is probably that they have never given Ukraine the resources they need to match Russia, resource for resource. In order to compensate then for that resource deficiency, the Ukrainians have constantly had to get creative or find ways to strike against those weak points in the Russian system. But it has also often been precisely those attempts to go after potential weak points that have drawn the most resistance from Ukraine's allies, whether that be long-range strikes into Russian territory or ground operations across the Russian border. The potential danger is that the type of war Ukraine's allies seem to want it to fight is also the one that denies it its best opportunities potentially to inflict asymmetric damage with limited resources. Only time will tell if these recent strikes have any effect in demonstrating the kind of value that striking into Russia might have, and the potential value that long-range precision Western missiles might have for that effort. Whatever the case may be, though, I don't think it should take away from what Ukraine managed to accomplish over the course of that week. The strikes arguably demonstrated the kind of damage that could be done when an evolving Ukrainian capability met an arguable Russian vulnerability. What remains to be seen is whether this was ultimately a one-off occasion, or whether Ukrainian drones and CC will claim a few more prizes yet. And alright, channel update to close out. Firstly, I'm aware this topic has been covered fairly widely, but I hoped I could come at it from a different angle. Basically asking not just what happened, but why did it go down the way it did, and what might the implications of that be. Hopefully, you found it valuable. Secondly, I just wanted to flag that next week might be a little bit difficult for me from a video perspective. I'll obviously do what I can to release as scheduled, but I did want to put that note up now. Perun gaming fans, that also applies to you, but I promise X4 will be returning and returning soon. On that gaming side note, because I know there are probably a few Battletech fans in the audience, I thought I'd let you know that Tex over at BPL has casually dropped a feature-length video that's been in production, I believe, for most of a year on the historic battle for Twycross, so I thought I'd give that massive effort a bit of a plug. Link will be in the description. Feel free to check it out. As for the rest of you, I expect I'll have plenty more to say next episode, but thank you so much for your continued support and engagement as always, and I very much hope to see you all again soon.